This is the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast with Cass Midgley and Marie Delafont.
We interview people you don't know about a subject no one wants to talk about. We hope to encourage people in the process of deconstructing their faith and help curb the loneliness that accompanies it. We think the world is a better place when more people live by sight, not by faith. Please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, you can support us monetarily in 2 easy ways. You can pledge
$1 million
or more through Patreon. That's patreon.com/EA podcast, or leave a lump sum donation through PayPal at our website, everyone'sagnostic.com. The smallest contribution is greatly appreciated.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 243 of the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast. I'm Cass Midgley. Just as a reminder, each and every one of us are going to fall asleep someday and never wake up. Did you know this podcast is free to everyone and free of ads? So a big thanks to each and every one of our Patreon and PayPal supporters that keep the show going. Today, Marie Delafont and I talk with author Jessica Wilbanks. Jessica Wilbanks is the author of When I Spoke in Tongues, a memoir about faith and its loss. Jessica received her Master's in Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction from the University of Houston. She's received many prizes and awards for her writings. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Salon, Houston Chronicle, Sojourners, The Rumpus, Long Reads, and Lit Hub. She's 38 years old, married, and a mother of a 3-year-old. For more information, visit jessicawilbanks.com. That's JESSICAWILBANKS.com. Her book, When I Spoke in Tongues, is available at most book outlets. Before we get into our talk with Jessica and Marie's monologue and announcements, I want to highlight a theme that emerges in today's interview, and that's this. There's an intellectually lazy way of looking at life, breaking everything down into 2 things. Binary thinking. Something is either good or bad, green or red, Chevy or Ford. And we often feel the need to choose one and stay loyal to it at all costs. That's fundamentalism. And then there's a higher way, the way of the Tao, that merges and mixes the 2 binaries as symbolized by the yin-yang. I recommend the TV series on Amazon Video called The Good Omen. It's a comical look at the end of the world, according to biblical prophecy. Heaven and hell are at war against each other and always have been. The 2 main characters are an angel and a demon who walk the earth appearing to be human. Over thousands and thousands of years of service to their spiritual headquarters, they become friends and find that they have much more in common than the polar opposite expectations. Another way of looking at the world and navigating its complexity is the Hegelian dialectic, which looks at the binaries, the thesis, and the antithesis, and tries to find a third way, the synthesis. Jessica Wilbanks models this in her view of Christianity, of writing, of her upbringing, and her person itself. None of us are one thing, opposite of the other. We're many things, at the same time and extremely complicated. The sooner we embrace the complexity of ourselves, our friends, the life in which we find ourselves, the better our life will play out, I believe. Interpreting life and people through grand narratives that seek to assign meaning to events are fairy tale fiction and can only be believed by the credulous minds of children, concrete thinkers, inflexible, and thus unable to honestly engage with reality. Jessica was raised in a church that encouraged speaking in tongues. I used to speak in tongues, a lot. I considered it a prayer language that I would use when I needed to keep praying, but didn't know what else to say, and had hours to go. It was a way of giving voice to the unknowable. You could say that it took abstract things like all my concerns, bouncing around my brain, conscious or unconscious, and all that was on God's heart for the earth. Speaking in tongues tangibleized these abstracts into vowels and consonants and sound waves. Tongues was a way to give people the impression that despite the circumstances, God was in control. We may not understand what's happening or even the words that are coming out of our mouth, but God does. It's code language, because demons could be listening. Tongues was a means to dispel confusion, and yet it only creates more, which is exactly how religion affects confusion. It attempts to take complex things and make them simple, binary, and seemingly controllable to anxious, nervous, scared people afraid to die and insulted by their mere animalness. Religions are human inventions attempting to simplify the complicated, define the ineffable, and box in the wild. And they are all exercises in futility that end up causing more damage than good. They appeal to superstitious people. They take advantage of weak-willed people and falsely elevate insecure people who like to claim their magical immortality project is superior to everyone else's. When I spoke in tongues, I believed my words made sense to God because He sees the heart. And the spoken word, the Logos, had the power to speak things into existence, even though I didn't know what I was saying. I was loosing in heaven what God wanted loosed on the earth, or vice versa. And I didn't have to understand. After all, His ways are not our ways. Foolishness in this context was godly. But in a church service, tongues can create confusion, which it did in the early church. In Corinth, Paul wrote to them in 1 Corinthians 14, laying out specific instructions on how tongues should be handled in public. After all, he writes in verse 33, God is not the author of confusion. Or other translations say God is not the God of disorder. But confusion and disorder is how the world works. If God isn't the God of confusion, then He's no God at all. Life is random, chaotic, meaningless, and happening exactly as it would if there were no God. Prayer changes nothing. Jesus never changed anyone. All the same things, good and bad, happen to all people, regardless of their religion or lack thereof. The only thing these mythologies have going for them is they can trick the person into thinking they can do something they otherwise could not. The placebo effect. One of my takeaways from this talk is to be wary of the single story, the narrow perspective, overconfidence, certainty, becoming a know-it-all, and wary of absolutes. In other words, be careful not to become a fundamentalist of anything. We taped this conversation on April 7th, 2019. The intro music is by Dave Weckl called Just Groove Me. Thanks for listening, and be a yes-sayer to what is.
I just wanted to share that if you followed our social media this week, you may have seen that I went to Jay Baker's church, Revolution Church in Minneapolis. I was just too curious. I went and participated in the open discussion afterwards and told him I disagreed with what he said. I challenged his entire sermon. I think that the sermon is not online yet, but it will be. If you want to check that out in the future, it's going to be the episode that's going to be about forgiveness, forgiving your enemies. So you can check that out in the future. Also, be aware that we still have merchandise. If you want to buy any stickers, you can contact us at everyone'sagnostic.com. And also, if you need anything at all from us, we're at everyone'sagnostic@gmail.com. If you want to get more involved in our community, you can ask to be added to our private Facebook group, our virtual support group, and or our sexuality discussion group. And you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now please join Cass and I as we interview the author of When I Spoke in Tongues, Jessica Wilbanks. So I don't know what you guys were able to discuss, but I'm in Minnesota and Cass is in Tennessee.
Oh, nice. Okay, great.
And she's in Houston.
Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. So I bought your book on Friday because I was looking at my schedule for the weekend and I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm going to interview Jessica on Sunday and she wrote a book. Maybe I'll read it. So I quickly bought it on Friday and I read it and I finished it about a half an hour ago.
Oh, no way. Wow, so it's very fresh in your mind right now.
It's super fresh in my mind. And it's kind of cool because like it's only through Everyone's Agnostic that I get these opportunities. Like this is going to be the second opportunity that I've had where I've read a book and then like just immediately after I get to talk to the author, which is really fucking cool because
that's so cool.
You know?
It's so funny because the book came out in November and I'm still really not used to kind of the phenomenon of going into conversations with people who have read it. So it's kind of fun for me too. Yeah.
So the shtick for us is that I'm amazing and then I read the book and then Cass doesn't.
I've always let my co-host read the books. I'm just
He did end up listening to your episode with Ryan Bell, and we've made a decision about this episode, right, Cass?
Yeah. Oh, we want it to be fun.
Great. So was the one with Ryan, you're like, oh man, if there's one thing we want to do, this is like the most boring thing ever. We're going to make ours really fun.
Well, so just so you know, Ryan and I are friends and I can talk about him behind his back. But he has his voice and I have mine and they're very different and we have different audiences and vive la différence.
Awesome.
What?
Vive la différence. My father used to say that all about. It's like celebrate difference or something. I don't know.
Is that what that means? Oh, I thought you were just starting to like sing nationalist phrases about France.
Or I could have been breaking into tongues, which brings us to the book. What a segue.
Nice segue.
So you did, in fact, speak in tongues, right?
I did.
At what age did you start?
So I was 11. It was so the first time was right after I was baptized, which was a very disappointing experience because I thought that I would emerge from the water perfect
with more than goosebumps.
Yeah, with more than goosebumps. Instead, had a lot of goosebumps. And I think, in retrospect, so I went to the bathroom and started getting dressed, was shivering literally, and then I felt like I was forming these syllables and just, was so excited, lit up, and was like, this is speaking in tongues. So from that point forward, I could call it up at will, for many years. And then as an adult, so I left the church when I was 15 and really didn't look back. And then at some point, when I was probably after college, I tried to speak in tongues again and I couldn't, the magic was gone.
Yeah.
Well, that's funny because I think it's for me, it was a prayer language. I mean, like there's two kinds of tongues to me in the New Testament. There's the kind God is speaking through you or something, and it requires interpretation in order for it to be relevant.
Yeah.
And then the other is like nobody's around and I'm using my tongue as a conduit for God to release things on earth, that which, is bound on earth and bound in heaven. And so, you can still do it. Yeah. Because it was willful the whole time. It was.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's funny to me that I have a block about doing it now because it's definitely more mental,
Well, it was sacred to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the way you described the first time, because if you're growing up in that and you're seeing grown-ups do it all around you, and it's a big deal, and it's actually to frame it, there's no bigger context to frame this in that you are about to be touched by the divine hand of God. Yeah. You're going to be filled with the Holy Spirit. Literally, God, the God that holds all the planets in place, is going to inhabit your body, and it's going to manifest in a fountain of expression called tongues.
I mean, it doesn't get better than that,
Right. Right. But to me, it's funny because I hear the same. I could take that same story, and it sounds like my first orgasm.
Yeah,
Because as a kid, I just, you'd hear about people having sex, and it was this big deal. And then you watch the films at school when they show you, the boys, you're about to go through puberty, and this is what's going to happen. You're going to get pubic hair, and you're going to get this and that. So I remember the exact time, the first time I orgasmed. And it makes me wonder, like, what was I doing rubbing myself if I'd never come before? But I guess rubbing felt good. So I guess I've done it for a long time. Even from, like, a child, they just rub themselves. And then all of a sudden, inside my body, it starts tingling and like, fuck, what the fuck? Oh, my God, it's happening. And I can just, like, you come out of the water of the baptism, and it's like, and you start feeling these syllables form, and it could be, this is the moment I've been waiting for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very similar. It's this, like my book is really kind of my journey of growing up with all of this kind of being so close to power and mystery and feeling so special, and then going on as an adult to live in this very lukewarm world, where you do get those moments of ecstasy, but they're few and far between. Whereas as a kid, that was like the atmosphere that I lived in. So I feel like the cool thing about Pentecostalism that can so quickly go so bad is that it is this very bodily, exuberant kind of physical faith with those moments of something approaching orgasm. I think it's actually a really good metaphor. And also the same moment of like, when you're wrapped up in a church service and you're in it, the music is playing, the preacher is preaching, and you really feel like you're so part of a community, and it's this unified kind of body and soul experience. And then on the car ride home, you find yourself snapping at your brother, I don't know. It's as a kid, I really blamed myself for that. I was like, why can't I inhabit this really wonderful mode all the time? Like there must be something wrong with me.
Yep.
And also, I want to just mention that I think we've set a record for how quickly we've brought up sex and orgasms on the show.
That was pretty quick.
That was really quick. Good job going there fast, Cass. So, Jessica, for me, like your book, so in the 3 days that I've been working on reading it, which is not a lot of days, but it's fucked with me like in the best way. And I keep texting my friends. I have a lot of former believing friends because that's the kind of community that I want to build up so that we can all relate to shit. And so I'm texting them. I'm like, so I'm reading this book, right? We're going to interview this lady on Sunday, and it's triggering the fuck out of me. They're like, oh no. I'm like, no. You don't understand. Like, I love triggers. Like personally, I like them because like that's where the growth is for me. And I feel strong enough to like handle the trigger. But I think if we're going to talk about personally, what I took away most well, I don't want to rank it, but one of the really big things that I took away from your book was memories. Like, I don't know what your brain is made out of that you could remember all this stuff so vividly, or if there was like some dramatic license involved in it. But even if it was, it doesn't really matter. Like, cause you got it so spot on for me in terms of like being able to recollect all of those experiences. Especially you really caught the emotional, like physical sensations of being in church so succinctly that like it brought me back. Like it was uncomfortable, and like, cause for me, like the way that I am working through my religious experience is a lot of it is just kind of flush it all out. Like I remember the big things, like the big things that I have problems with, and they're mostly conceptual and ideas that I'm upset about, or big particular events that happened to me, but all of the other little feelings and experiences and day-to-day interactions were just kind of, my brain was just like, nah, let's just flush all that shit away. It's gone. And I think it does that with everything. So I don't know that it's exclusive to religion, but just the way your brain works, the way you are a writer, the way that you capture your moments every day and are so, like your descriptions are so vivid. And they just really brought me back and brought up a lot of memories for me. Like we were just mentioning your baptism. I was baptized as a baby, so obviously I don't remember that. But then we ended up getting involved in a Baptist church, which they do, baptisms like when you're a teenager or when you're of age to be able to know what that means. So I ended up getting baptized twice. And so the second time that I did it was right around when I started having doubts, like I think maybe a month before I got baptized. I was writing in my journal, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. And then a month later was my first foray into trying to overcompensate for my doubts. And that's when I got baptized. And I remember walking down those steps and into that water, and the way that the robe just clung to my body, and how the lights just beamed on me and warmed me up. And then just all these like blurry gray bodies out in the pews just looking at me, and then the reverberation of my voice on the mic, like it all just came back to me. And then walking back up the stairs with the water sucking the robe back onto me, and then going upstairs just dripping and feeling like what I just went through was something so intense and powerful, and I'm not the same anymore. And I just started shaking, like just trembling. And when I look back now, I'm like, oh, that was my first anxiety attack. Okay,
that's what that was.
This makes sense now. Yeah. And I thought, like, I don't know what I thought of it at the time, but like just reading about your experience and like how it felt, like really brought it back for me. And that was, I was not happy. What's the word? I like to go back to those memories that I can't access anymore, because it's healing in some way that I can't totally describe. It reminds me that they're real, you know?
Yeah, and you know, it's funny that you talk about that experience of just kind of when you walked away, like just slamming the door closed, you know, because I did that too, you know, like I stopped believing at 15, but then had to go to church with my parents until I left their house completely when I was like, I guess, close to 18, and I went off to college. And for many years, like I never went back to church. I never got close to any of that stuff. And I completely disregarded it, you know, like even maybe 10 years ago. So I'm 38 now, you know, in my late 20s, like if someone was like, oh, you grew up Pentecostal, like that must have really fucked with you. You know, I would have been like, no, it didn't really affect me at all. And that, I don't think that's true in the least, but it wasn't until in retrospect, like I see my drive to go to Southern Nigeria and study like the roots of Pentecostal Christianity as kind of like getting myself back in those environments as an adult, so I could finally deal with it, you know? And I don't think if I hadn't done that trip, I don't think I would have been able to really kind of claim those body sensory memories, because, you know, it all came back during that trip. And I was just like, for, you know, 3 hours a day for like 2 months, I was in these services feeling like a kid again, you know? And I no longer, like, I started out writing this book and being like, oh, it'll be this academic exploration of Pentecostal Christianity and I won't be a character at all. And then I was like, oh, actually, it's a memoir. You know, there's a reason why I'm so drawn to this material. But
so when you left, when in your heart you stopped believing around 15 or 16, you say?
Yeah, when I was 15, but it was kind of a complicated like stop, because it was an intellectual stop, you know, like there was this moment where it was this dedication service for a church in Baltimore. So we lived in Southern Maryland. We drove up to kind of be in solidarity with this sister church in Baltimore. And it was this very elaborate, like, you know, 3-4 hour service with a very intense praise and worship session. I had gotten a scholarship to this private high school, and I was for the first time around these kids who were very religious and conservative. You know, like in my mind, they were, you know, heathen because they weren't Pentecostal, but no one, you know, I never met anyone who didn't believe in God. So I was already separating a little bit. You know, I was that typical teenage thing of just being humiliated by your family and everyone. So it was this whole cloth rejection of like this blue collar culture, you know, this very conservative mindset, also God. And I just didn't want any part of it anymore. But I think I still, even though I was like, I remember this moment where I was like, God, I'm taking a break. Like, I just can't do this anymore. Maybe I'll come back and believe again, but I just am going to shut the door right now. But I think for many years, I still operated as if there was a God, you know, like I still felt like I was bad, you know, I felt a lot of shame. It was this very fundamentalist mindset that I took with me, even though I thought, you know, I was like, oh yeah, I'm an atheist now. You know, I don't believe in anything.
Did your parents know, or did you keep it to yourself?
No. Although I had this so in high school, I fell in love with my best friend, another woman, and wrote about it in my diary. We were hooking up, and my dad found my journal, and
Uh-oh.
it was this moment of like I wrote a lot in that journal about how I didn't believe anymore, how I was, smoking pot, like, very minor kid
Yeah.
stuff. But it was this incredibly awful moment where this kind of secret self that I had, that who was a non-believer, who was experimental, who was exploring these feelings I had for my friend, where suddenly that was kind of under my parents' gaze.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
they knew about that and then completely rejected it. They're like, this isn't you. You've been swayed by an evil spirit or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I'm super intrigued by your journey in terms of the deconversion element of it and then the sexuality element of it. The part about the deconversion, or I don't know if that's the word you would use, but the experience that you had where you wrote down, Jessica Banks is not a Christian anymore. I think that's what did you do third person?
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah, I did, which is weird.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's a way to really own it and not just use a generic I, but like call out your own name and really say it.
Yeah.
But I mean, as soon as I read that, I was like, fuck, like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was, because for me, like I started doubting when I was 13, and I couldn't release it until like my early 20s because I was taught not to trust myself, which I'm sure you can relate to
Oh,
an extent, that you're
sure.
full of shit. And like the way I read the book, and maybe you underemphasized it, but like it was just like you fucking like realized it in one moment and then just flushed it out and like didn't even turn back, you know?
Well, and that was, I think, the only reason I was able to do that was because I was in this weird moment going to this high school, and being around kids who were so different from me was this license to kind of live like I started kind of siloing myself, like I'm one person with my
Yeah.
family, I'm one person in the church, and
Wait, what'd you call that? Silo yourself?
yeah, like I was so
Like compartmentalizing.
compartmentalized. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other thing that was really kind of alive for me was I always identified as like a creative person and a writer. So when I was like,
Mm.
around the same age, I went away to this week-long kind of writing thing for high school kids in Pennsylvania. And I was like, oh, these are my people. So I had these kind of split identities where I was this really good girl, who was a deep believer, and then I was also this really, creative kid who loved poetry and read all these books that my mom didn't let me read, but felt very confident in that identity too. And
Hmm.
then I think there was this point where there was so much cognitive dissonance about what I was hearing in church, like
Mm.
gay people are evil, abortion is always murder. I just didn't really buy it. But I
Mm.
never, even to this day, like I'm really attracted to the aspects of like, the Jesus figure who is this force of liberation and revolution. I feel like in
Yeah.
another lifetime I could totally be this very radical Christian. But
Yeah.
in the end, like all the political baggage around contemporary Christianity, I just was totally disgusted by it. I wanted to get as far
Yeah.
away from it
Yeah.
as I could.
Yeah.
So do you still have friends that are Christians?
I don't. I do. Well, I guess I do. So, my family is still in the church. My youngest brother is still very devout. My parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I have colleagues who are also very Christian, but I don't have any close friends who are. And I think
Yeah.
it would be hard to,
Mm.
to have those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is that the friends that I have, and I would say they're not necessarily people that I spend a lot of time with, but we both consider each other friends and mutually respectful and such. But they are the type of Christians, like you just said, that are like social justice and
Yeah.
liberation theology and the best Jesus possible, and
Yeah,
and mostly because that's the only one that they would ever bow the knee to, and that's their
Yeah.
own integrity showing up.
Yeah.
And I think we all get that, and it's just that we, for whatever reason, I no longer felt the need to try to keep Jesus alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I've often used the metaphor of like, what is it? When you keep somebody alive on machines,
Life
Oh,
support. Yeah.
life support.
Yeah.
I kept Jesus on life support for the longest time because I went from fundamental evangelicalism to Unity Church and like Unitarian Universalist, and
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And maybe kind of Oprah spirituality, where
Sure, sure.
you try to keep Jesus alive on life support. And after a while, you can have all the assets and virtues of social justice and
Exactly.
liberation
Exactly.
and equality and
Yeah.
et cetera, without carrying him along like a corpse over your shoulder.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like there's some more work to do with that for me because I'm really interested. There's this pastor, Gordon Cosby, who I've had this dream for many years of writing a biography about. Like, he started out Southern Baptist, had a total crisis of faith when he was a D-Day chaplain, and he was like counseling all these young men who were, about to die the next day, and they would convert to Christianity, and then it wouldn't give them any comfort whatsoever. And he was this very young man, during World War II, and that really shook him. He's like, what is this faith if it can't help somebody who's about to die the next day? It must be this surface level thing. So he ended up throwing himself into social justice, marched with Dr. King at Selma, and was just this really incredible figure. And I got to know him toward the end of his life when I lived in Washington, D.C. And he was just so hung up on Jesus, and I didn't really get it because he had thrown out so much about Christianity. He got rid of his church building. He was doing these like encounter groups between people across lines of difference. Christianity like was almost unrecognizable in the work that he was doing.
Right.
And I was really into the work that he was doing, but the Jesus figure was what came between like our different worldviews. And for him, you still had to kind of communicate to this historical figure of Jesus and accept that in some way. Whereas I said, can't you just accept being compassionate toward all people? Can't you just accept like, downward mobility, those kinds of things? In the church I was growing up in, that Jesus figure was shorthand for all of the submission rhetoric that you needed to kind of bow to in order to be part of the community.
And defer credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, you're taking glory, and it's going to appeal to your pride, and it's going to be a stumbling block. And
yeah, which is so weird because I think that, like what you said, like the best version of Christianity, like the things that people can do, when inspired by that really, idealistic kind of philosophy of, we're going to be here for each other. We're going to do this work in the world because of this inspiration that we have. I think it's incredible, and it's like, I don't think that you should defer the credit to Jesus. Like, I think that, there's something there on its own that I'm really drawn to. Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating because the Auburn Tigers of the NCAA basketball tournament, when this comes out, this is long overdue, but like March Madness was, and they were like a 5th seed and they got all the way to the Final Four. And they showed some clips in the locker room, and their coach is a guy named Bruce Pearl. He used to coach at the University of Tennessee, anyway, et cetera, et cetera. But he was all about God in the locker room talk. He was all about God's got a plan for this team, and et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, I'm kind of like throwing up in my mouth, and I don't, I don't want to. That's just nonsense. However, this 5th seed team kept winning and winning and winning, and it reminded me. Not that God's good to like fucking basketball teams, but that placebo is powerful. And when you're tapping in to the God thing. And so when I look back at my life and the times that I was evangelical, truth is I accomplished some amazing things because I thought that God was the wind beneath my wings.
Absolutely.
My brain is my reality. And if my brain believes it, it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, there's this, not only this temptation to give God credit while you're in it, but there's maybe for post-Christians, we look back and go, well, that happened. And so what does that mean? Well, if we truly, right, if we truly believe that there is no interventionary God, then we have to ask ourselves, what was that? And the only answer, at least to a non-theist, is that was me.
Yeah. The only time that I've been in a similar mindset, like I think it's really hard for people to understand who haven't been in that world,
right?
Like what it feels like to be so singularly committed. You live in this black and white world. You're on the side of good. It's very clear what you should do. You're so driven. You're so literally purpose driven. So when I was in my like early 20s, I volunteered with Move On, and I spent 3 months in St. Petersburg, Florida, basically in this windowless strip mall office for like 12 hours a day, calling random people saying, "Hey, do you want to beat Bush? Come to an emergency meeting at the strip mall." And we gradually organized this community. During those 3 months, I was miserable, didn't keep up relationships. I ate terrible food. I just sat and made phone calls all day. But I felt this incredible feeling of purpose, because at the moment I really believed like this is what I should be doing with my life. Like I should be trying to beat Bush. I should be working as hard as I can. Nothing else matters. And I feel like it was this incredible sensation of, kind of this pure feeling. Because usually in modern life, like my daily life, I have a 3-year-old, I have a husband, I have friends, I have family, I have commitments. I feel splintered all the time. I feel like I'm always screwing something up, But in that 3-month period, I just felt like this soldier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was how I felt all the time when I was a Christian.
Yeah. This makes me think of, and we talked about it just very, very little bit at the beginning of the show about that shift from a life filled with ecstasy and spiritual orgasms to, if you deconvert or let go of that stuff, the monotony and the gray and the ambiguity of the day to day. I'm interested in talking about like the grief that is involved in that shift. I think one of the things that you kept on touching on over and over in the book was the way that the religion is structured to get you like involved in this narrative, this story arc that that we've just been talking about, that there's this power that you have access to, that there's this divine God that's, calling you to be pure, etc. And I just don't think I've been able to look back on that time and to be able to put into words what was being spoken to me and like what was guiding me during that time. And so I think the loss of that, I just kind of purged it from my mind.
Yeah.
And I think ever since then, I've just been depressed and like looking for purpose. And sometimes that purpose looked like having an eating disorder. Sometimes that purpose looked like being consumed with an unhealthy relationship. And you brought this up in your book, and I think it was still when you were a bit younger that you were kind of exploring with your like out crowd, and you asked yourself, is this all there is? Like, you're doing fun stuff and whatever, but still like fun stuff is fun stuff. But being a part of a mission where you're like best friends with like the head honcho, and he's like giving you all like sorts of cool stuff and like letting you be part of the big missions. Like, how does that even compare to like doing pot and listening to music on like
banality?
Yeah.
How do you manage that grief, that loss, and reorienting yourself to the world around you? Do you find new purpose, or do you just realize there is no purpose and you just what do you do?
The thing that I think of, and I wish I had a great answer for you. Like, I think that, but the thing that I think about when you ask that question, I saw this writer once in Houston give this lecture at a bookstore. He's a Vietnam veteran, and he writes really movingly about his experience in wartime. And someone gets up in the audience and says, kind of like a stupid question that made you hate them. He's like, "What do you think the secret of war is?" And you're like, "Oh my God," But this guy's response was, "I think the secret of war is how hard it is to go back and be a civilian again, after you're in this experience of war." And he talked about how in war, like, your senses are so heightened all the time, and you're with your comrades in arms, and you have a mission, you have a purpose. It's similar to what I was talking about with the election thing. But, in peacetime, you live day to day, and you don't have one great campaign, to be working on. I think it's kind of a gradual process of learning to be okay and learning to kind of see purpose in your life, even in the absence of that kind of binary world, like on a daily basis, I am not the hero of my life. I'm a lot of different personas. Like, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a friend, I'm a writer. Like, there's no greater kind of narrative, like you said, that connects all of those pieces and allows me to, really be convinced that my life will have meaning. And I think it's kind of like I'm more drawn now toward this super, pseudo-American Buddhist sensibility. I don't have any formal Buddhist training, but I think sitting with that banality, and learning to find meaning in those small moments. And I think for me, like it's really intricately connected to writing, because in writing, it's almost become kind of a spiritual practice to like look in my life and try to bring out the details, like the physical details that added up into this big narrative that drove me for so long, and kind of dissect that, and be like, okay, what was it like getting out of that baptismal font, and now I spend a lot of time like thinking about those kinds of things, like images and those kind of sense memories, as opposed to like those big questions like what should I do with my life?
Yeah.
Well, there's no way to minimize or this. My mother's in the nursing home and she's 91, and part of what I can see that is just killing her is purposelessness.
Yeah.
And it started back with empty nest, probably when she was, in her 40s or 50s or whatever. And so this need to be a part of something bigger than oneself, you can't underestimate it.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
huge.
Absolutely.
Even now, my friend Dave Warnock is living here. He's dying of ALS. He probably has 3 years to live, but he just, he retired from being an insurance agent. He moved in with me because he has, he's going to need help with physical needs. And, and so he's been here maybe a week and a half off and on. Because he does globetrot a little bit and he flies around here and there to see people, which is his goal. But on the days that he has nothing planned, he gets a little freaked out. And this is by his own admission. This isn't me just describing him. He said, I got to get out of this headspace, and otherwise I don't have a reason to get up out of bed.
Yeah.
And also for him, the time is ticking. The why am I wasting this moment? I have so few of them left.
Yeah.
So this is big deal, and it's probably the reason that humans ever invented religion.
Totally. I mean, there's this incredible book that I came across when I was kind of writing about the experience of like losing faith. It's by the sociologist Peter Berger, and he talks about this metaphor as religion as the sacred canopy that we can drape over ourselves and feel safe, feel like there's some overarching, narrative and world that makes sense. And it makes a ton of sense, like I think that if we, like the three of us, like sat down over a weekend and we're like, okay, we're going to create like this community that provides that kind of narrative and cohesiveness and like sense of purpose for people, it would probably look a lot like church, because it would have to include something otherworldly. Like I've been really attracted to the idea of being part of one of these kind of agnostic or atheist communities. Like here in Houston, there's the Oasis Network, and I saw them at the March for Science, and I was so delighted that there's this group of people that exists that's not formed around this kind of supernatural force, but rather around humans helping humans. It's really attractive to me. But at the same time, like in my busy life, like I don't make space and time for that. But if I was terrified that if I didn't, I would go to hell, that I might, know.
But, right. Yeah.
Like I teach a lot of creative writing workshops here in Houston, and it feels like this kind of countercultural move for this group of strangers to get together. I teach nonfiction and write about stories from our lives, like moments that we're still trying to unpack and figure out like why they're worthwhile. And I've been thinking a lot about how, like when I was a kid in these churches, a common story was we live in a culture that doesn't value family, that doesn't value all these different things. But now I feel like it's so clear for me to see that we do live in a culture that doesn't value looking for purpose. I think it's so easy to live in the culture that we live in today in the US and be consumers, and be workers and have simple roles in our relationship with other people, and not to take a step back and really think about our larger purpose and, the short time that we have left and what kind of contribution we want to make. And I think that, especially in the secular world, there isn't a lot of space for that. So I'm really interested in that. And for me, like writing has really become the way that I can kind of interact with something a little bit greater than my intellectual self, like
Yeah.
something more kind of subconscious and intuitive.
Yeah.
And for other people, it might be yoga or, volunteering somewhere. But I think we desperately need that. And we don't talk a lot about it.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I love about talking to people, and the purpose of this show is to help people that are deconverted not feel stupid or crazy or lonely.
Yeah.
And when we can land on something to where it's like, oh yeah, that's why Christianity is so toxic, because it appears so benign that we're like, oh, we want to cuddle back up to that abusive relationship. We want to go back to that. Well, you just pinpointed something that grand narratives like religion provides. They inoculate us from our own internal pursuit of a grand narrative. That's ours.
Absolutely.
It hands us, it spoon feeds us right out of the womb, especially as children. We walk right into it.
Yeah.
And we are given a pacifier for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
But it's at such a cost because
I agree.
I know that you're not arguing. I'm just thinking about how, in addition to the toxicity of here's the grand narrative, just kind of stick yourself to it. It's a grand narrative that only succeeds in that it marginalizes so many people. And I think that was when I was a kid, that's what really drew me away from the church. Was I was like, there's something, if everyone's a sinner, there's something really wrong about the fact that some sins are super sins, and that if you're gay, you're not just a sinner, you're evil. There was this I felt so much shame, even though I really knew within myself that there was nothing wrong with being bisexual. The Jesus that I kind of thought of in my head would never have anything against that. If part of Christianity is this feel-good community where people, are part of each other's grand narrative, the other side of that is this total exile and total isolation of anything that doesn't fit that narrative, and that's devastating.
Yeah.
I think that's the other side of that, where anytime you're feeling really good in that community, you also know that if you tiptoed over that line, the full force, the total opposite of that inclusion would, be directed toward you. You would be completely excommunicated from that community.
Yeah. Something I wanted to talk about in terms of purpose that we were just touching on here for a moment is when I was Christian, and Jessica, for you, just a brief synopsis. I started doubting when I was 13 and then went kind of on a roller coaster ride of disbelief for 12, 13 years before kind of deconverting.
Yeah.
During that time, I was a missionary, and that gave me a huge sense of purpose. And I got involved in a lot of things, like Cass said, that I probably had no rights to be involved in. I was the director of marketing for a YWAM base in Mexicali, Mexico, which
Wow.
what the fuck I was 19 or 20, and what the fuck am I doing down there? But it gave me a lot of opportunities. But anyway, point being, we were all working together for the same purpose. It was a very high purpose. It was about saving people, literally.
What could be better than that? Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And when I'm compassionate to myself, I think, well, yeah, if that's what I believed, and then I really think I'm an amazing person. I gave up everything in the US to go down and to try to save people. That was my worldview, and the sacrifice was real. But point being, anyway, that I derived a lot of a sense of purpose from my times when I really did believe what I was in and was acting that out. Then when I left all of that, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier too, that next decade was spent, how can I say it? Not psychosomatically, but there were symptoms of that loss.
Yeah.
So it was the eating disorder and the unhealthy relationships and just a lot of mental illness and stuff.
Yeah.
And eventually I got through that, and I'm in a lot healthier place. And so now I'm in this place where I don't think there is any purpose. There's no grand purpose to anything, objectively. And yes, we can create meaning for ourselves, but in the end, that doesn't matter either.
Yeah.
At least this is my view on things. And at the same time, and this is what I'm getting to for me, I haven't felt that sense of purpose, of focus, until I got onto this show. And I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting how I would feel about that, but there's something about being on this show and talking about what we went through, trying to heal from it, trying to make sense of it, trying to move forward, trying to reorient ourselves to the reality of the world around us. And I've heard people, atheists or former fundamentalists, talk about their longing to create a legacy, like they're an impact on the world. And I never really understood that. I was like, but we're all just a bunch of dumb apes, and we're all going to die, and the sun is going to eat us all. And like, very nihilist. I'm like, what's the point? Like, I'll do what I can do, but I'm not going to try too hard. But like, and so after the show's been up there, it finally hit me. I'm like, I could die now and be really happy because I've put my voice out there, and like there's this resource out there, and I've made myself known. I've said to the world, you fucked me up, and I'm gonna talk about it, and I have, and there's nothing else you can do to me.
Yeah.
Some of those first emails that came in from like fans or listeners who were like, "Oh, Marie, thank you so much for saying that, or for being you, or for coming on the show. You've made such a difference." And imagine if you're a heroin addict and you recovered, and then there's this natural herb out there that creates the same, release. It can remind you of the heroin or whatever. I guess what I'm saying is that you did all that work as a YWAMer that was so fulfilling and so enriching and rewarding and validating.
Yeah.
And then only to like lose it all. And then you come back and it might have a similar feeling when you start getting these emails back from fans or listeners.
Yeah.
That's like, oh my gosh, that's that similar feeling, but this time it's real.
Yeah.
Yeah. Marie, the other thing that it makes me think of is like, since I wrote the book, like I didn't know about any of these communities before that, which I'm kind of surprised about. Like, but since I read the book, I've been part of these, like I've joined various Facebook groups like ex-evangelicals and gotten to know some of these figures like in this kind of deconversion world. And something that I've seen in that, like I've had to take a step away from some of these Facebook groups because the level of kind of self-blame among people who, write their stories, just thinking of ex-evangelical, for example, like people just feel like they're fucking idiots, like they believed this stuff for so long. They went out there and tried to get other people to believe it. Like they're just so full of shame. And it just, I can feel it coming across the computer screen, and it's so real. And I think for you being in a position to like be part of this podcast, and for me writing this book, part of our, need to believe in purpose, even though, like you said, we are all a bunch of apes. Like I think there's something so fulfilling about the idea that our kind of deepest shame could be turned into a source of relief in the moment for someone who's going through something similar, so for me, like I get the same kind of joy that you talk about from talking to new writers. I did this like mentorship thing not long ago and got to be in a position where I was a mentor to a young writer who's really reminded me of where I was 10 years ago and helped demystify some of these things for her. It was probably the most fulfilling thing I've done in like years, because I was in a position to kind of speak to a version of my former self and, tell her what I wish someone had told me. And I think that kind of cyclical support, it feels like magic,
because there's the kind of therapy where your therapist can conjure up the memory of something that you went through and try to kind of use a scientific form of hypnosis to kind of heal you through that event and see it in a different way. And then there's also finding you in someone else who is in front of you, who's listening to you, who's in that same mental spot that you were in. And you're able to say those things to them that you wish you could have said them. Maybe you don't have that memory to go back there to heal yourself and to tell yourself the sweet things that you needed to hear. So that just like what you said just made me think of that and why that is so incredibly healing, because it's a very tangible, like face-to-face kind of way to heal your inner trauma.
Because you're never going to that person and saying, you are an idiot. You stayed 10 years too long. You did that. But we do talk to ourselves that way all the time.
Well, and what idiot would turn down eternal life and conditional love? We weren't fools.
That's totally true. Yeah. And what idiot would like walk away from what feels like a loving support network, especially when you think there's nothing to walk toward, there's no like there's only nothingness. Like that's awful. I don't think it was a coincidence that when I did leave the church at 15, like I started chain smoking. I started, doing all kinds of drugs. I started being really self-destructive, like you said, Marie, like, because why
Yep.
not? Like, because I think that's such a popular narrative in church, like that if you didn't have this divine structure in place, it would be total chaos, and of course you believe that.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a line in some of the worship songs we sing where, like, where else would we go, Lord?
I wouldn't be surprised if there was.
No, I think I remember similar things, even because there is this sense of like you can turn around and look at the exit out of Christianity, and it's just so bleak. It's like, oh, this is warm and cozy. This is comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I remember all that rhetoric about, like if we let gay people get married, people would want to marry, elephants or what. Like we just can't imagine a world like a humane world. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's really weird.
Yeah. Just touching a little bit back on what we were just talking about, I think that I appreciated, at times I was reading your book and then I thought, should we be interviewing her or not? Like, I don't know where she's going with
Is she
this.
one of us?
Kind of. I was like, I'm going to get to the end of this book and she better be atheist because, and I say that lovingly because like you wrote the book in such a way, and I assume this is how you feel about it. There's a compassion or a love almost that you have for parts of the church experience. And particularly, I saw it at the very end of the book where you're describing having gone to kind of a tamer church, a non-sensationalist miracle working, kind of a church. It seemed that you enjoyed the experience of the community being together. You light the candle that you're holding by it being lit by the person next to you. And it's just kind of this community connecting kind of sense. And you're there with your mom and your son. And when you could, you always appreciated the human parts of church.
But the funny thing, and I had this in the book at one point, but I couldn't quite figure out a way to make it work. So that church service that I went to with my mom, turns out that like kinder, gentler pastor within the year that I went to that church service was accused of embezzling $80,000 from the congregation.
Oh my God.
Isn't that crazy? So I didn't want to like let the church off the hook, but at the same time, I tried to figure out what I was longing for, and for me, it very much was like that ecstasy. There is a tremendous amount of danger in the church, I think. And that's what I really tried to draw out in terms of the way that power is wielded and how many victims there are. And they're typically not, white men who are the victims in these situations, like, because men are on top of this hierarchy, and women and children are underneath that. I think that the whole thing about like pastors who are in charge of congregations like that with no oversight, it's never going to end well, So I kind of wish I could revise that a little bit because I think it's important. Like, I don't want to give people the feeling that, there is some version of this that works out well, because I think these churches, a characteristic about them is that there are people who are able to abuse power so much, and that's not talked about.
Well, and the phrase that there's always going to be good people, there's always going to be bad people, but it takes religion in order for good people to do bad things. Because I do think that at its worst, Christianity appeals to the darker angels of our natures, and it inflates the darker things. I mean, like, so we were just talking yesterday, Marie and I, with a guest. It was clear that the most beautiful way to engage other human beings in relationships, close or distant, but primarily like the closer you're going to have to cohabitate with this, the better you're going to be off, and the better your dynamic relationship is going to form if you're both agnostic. You see things in that other person. A lot of times people that live close together, husbands and wives, etc., they see the blind spots of their spouses, of their partners, and in, this phrase, "you know me better than I know myself," is sometimes true. But if you don't handle that with care, if you don't handle that with, I'm going to gently let that person figure that out on their own and not take the role of instructor, of teacher, student, of hierarchy.
Yeah.
And but if you think about the toxicity of forming a hierarchy and all the assumption and presumption that requires, what the fuck is Christianity other than a person taking a position of, I know something that you don't. You cannot be and adapt Christianity without immediately becoming arrogant, which is the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, I don't know though, because I feel like that's what happens in churches, and that's what happens in this manifestation of Christianity today. But when I think about like the historical Jesus, I don't see any of that hierarchy there.
Yeah. Well, we definitely have fucked it up, and it started with Paul. It started like the moment that Jesus died.
Completely agree. And interestingly, it started with this kind of like, so as part of the book, I went back and kind of went into the history of like speaking in tongues, and it started like the disciples after Jesus died, were devastated, but also humiliated, like they were like totally left out to dry, and they were mourning, that whole story about mourning in the upper room, and then started speaking in tongues. And that was this divine symbol that like all is not lost, when really I think all should have been lost.
Yeah. It all went downhill from there.
Oh, it was this miracle. The prophecies are true. Like Paul was claiming this, like, I don't know, it was this move and this resurrection of something that
should have died.
It should have died. Yeah, because I think if it had died, we could kind of go back to that sensibility and say, okay, I'm just going to try to live like that. I'm going to, engage with people who are outcasts to the rest of the world. Yeah. I'm going to dodge some of these questions. I'm not going to embrace any Messiah figure, instead I'm going to live differently, because that to me is so appealing. But I agree with you, like the minute it gets into this church situation and there's some person, usually a man, who is the arbiter of what is good and what is bad and tells people to stay with their husbands, rather than the divine sin of divorce. I don't know. It's just, people have a way of fucking up everything that they come in contact with.
Well, I think this is brilliant. And then getting back to like some of us have friends that are still Christians, and I respect them greatly. I've had 15 or 20 of them on the show. Yeah. This is an atheist show, and I've had 15 or 20 Christians on this show that are Christians to this day, and they're people that I respect. And in some ways, I was parading them by the audience to say, like, there is a way to do this and not be an asshole, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And one of those, the way that you just described that, there's a theme that I think comes up in people that adopt a decent Christianity, and that is an emphasis on the crucified Christ, and not so much this tantrum that the church threw by losing Jesus to death. Exactly. And then, okay, so just last night, this is really fresh on my mind, just last night I watched the movie Vice about
Dick Cheney.
And the way he really overpowered George W. Bush. And what happened was he was such a power monger that when 9/11 happened, he saw it as a way, for one thing, he could appeal to George W. because George W. was always trying to get his daddy's approval. And his daddy was unable to kill Saddam Hussein. Cheney said, look, okay, this 9/11 just happened, which is tragic. Your dad never got Saddam Hussein, which is tragic. We have a chance here to actually make these wrongs right. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
And it's like, if you had left that the fuck alone, we wouldn't have ISIS today. Like you went to a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. You went, there was no weapons of mass destruction. All of this was your fucking ego. Horrible result of doing something that didn't need to be done, and it was completely done by white men from ego and from pride and the shame of like, we're not going to let this happen on our watch, and all this machoism. Yeah. And that's what I feel like now, and just in this conversation, I feel like that Acts chapter whatever, that's when Dick Cheney showed up in the New Testament and and ruined Christianity.
I think it's actually really important because there is this impulse in the church to save face, and to like this impulse in like the way that like Jerry Falwell Jr. is acting right now, defending Trump no matter what he does. Like it's just this it's so gross and it's so different. And I think this is part of my journey with this book, was trying to figure out, is there this pure kernel under Christianity that I can hold on to even with all this, all these terrible things that people do? And I think I ended up in the position, Marie, to your delight, that the pure kernel is humanity.
There you go. I totally
And the
agree.
fact that like I was so interested in these early days of the Azusa Street revival, and this idea that, Charles Parham, who's always called the father of Pentecostalism, he tried for years to, start a revival. And when quote unquote revival came, it came in this African American community in, what was basically at the time like a ghetto in Los Angeles. And that's that feeling, Cass, that you were talking about earlier, like this, what we always heard, like, I can do all things through Christ, like where that energy came alive was in this congregation that the world and the political system had always told them, like, you are on the outside, you are, marginal people, like God doesn't care about you. And they kind of claimed that promise, and as a result, felt like they were ushering in this, real moment in American Christianity. So I don't know, like it's weird now because I don't believe that anything supernatural happened in that revival.
Right.
I don't believe that, God came down and touched them. But at the same time, like I don't want to reject the part of Christianity that gives people who wouldn't otherwise have it the power and the license to dream big, and see themselves as special. And I think I don't know, I think there's something really human about that we could take this belief system that has that revolutionary potential and do horrible things with it, even as people are doing great things with it. That's just the way it is to be a person.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like, I have to feel like there's nothing special about Christianity.
Yeah, I agree.
The thing that we're talking about here is that it gives people a sense of purpose, that it binds people together. You don't need a religion for that. Like, religion is most effective because usually it involves fear.
Yeah.
And fear is effective for compliance. It just makes me afraid that we're going to be like, okay, if your kid has a lot of anxiety about the world, then make sure to keep letting them believe in Santa Claus, like up until they're an adult, because that's best for them, know? And like, I don't, maybe that's.
Well, it reminds me of the story I came across in writing the book about, Marie, maybe you remember the story about Jenny Glassy, she was like this teenager, from the Midwest. She accepted the Lord at this like tent revival and decided that, God had given her these missionary tongues, and managed to, like, through that whole thing, saying that God had touched her and given her these magical languages, she ended up making it all the way to Liverpool, later in Palestine, like being a missionary. And I love that story because, like, without, like, as a non-believer, I don't believe that she really, maybe she, thought at some point that she had these missionary tongues, but when this representative from the church came to Liverpool to kind of test her, she got out of it. She was like, oh, God wouldn't want me to be tested, So I kind of see her as this person who, like, seized on this narrative in a way that allowed her to have this big adventure, and what else could have gotten this girl out of this town, out of this gender role that she wouldn't otherwise be able to get out of, like she was able to travel, she was able to see the world, she was able to, be in a very different situation, have a lot of power, like she couldn't have gotten away with that in any other circumstance. I mean, and I think that's like, it's a similar way that Christianity showed up in the civil rights movement in the US. Like I think that was a big breaking point for like American Christians who went to church every day and said, oh yeah, we're all created equal in the eyes of God. And then they had to face the fact, of this deep entrenched racism. So I think like, I don't know, I think you're right that there's nothing special about Christianity, but when we live in a culture where that's like our predominant narrative, in some cases, going with that narrative allows people like Jenny Glassy to transcend some kind of cultural bias, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think it's like a redeeming factor as much as it is like an interesting
This is just a
example
cultural
of
reality because Christianity
yeah,
co-opted
yeah.
everything that they have, and then they
Yeah,
infiltrate
exactly,
a society to where it's the water we're swimming in, and then for somebody like MLK to like borrow it back, not knowingly or intentionally, he just wandered into it because of his culture, but to use that tool that is there, because God damn it, we can't, nobody can deny that Christianity is not a juggernaut of power in the West.
Yeah.
It is the most powerful narrative in the West.
Yeah, you can wield Christianity like we've talked for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. You can wield Christianity to do a lot of damage. And I think what you're talking about, Jessica, is let's just notice the times when Christianity has been wielded to produce positive change.
Yeah.
Just putting aside all the horrible things that it's done, let's just just notice.
You're saying that so much better than I could, because I think so much of the time people use that, like the times that Christianity has been used for positive change, as like proof that it must be true.
And
you
we're
know,
not going there,
and that's not
sure.
at all my argument. Like, like, but I do think, like, I've always felt weird to put kind of the typical kind of uber intellectual, cerebral arguments that typically white atheists have, in the West, next to, the belief system that, of the historic Black church. I resist the idea that there's something fundamentally flawed about one belief system. I think in the historic Black church in the US, Christianity has been this creative tool to overcome oppression, that there's something really incredible about that. Whereas I think there's similarly in modern kind of atheist rhetoric, there can also be people can succumb to the same biases that people do in Christianity and any other belief system. So I think I'm kind of like belief agnostic in a way.
Well, that's exactly what we're saying. It's the opposite of fundamentalism. People thinking that they know is when it becomes problematic.
Yeah.
It's almost like everyone is, I don't know, agnostic.
That's a great way to end.
Out of the stuff that I was reading in your book, a lot of times I found you in situations where I would have had an anxiety attack, and there was no acknowledgement from you in the book that it ever made you feel uncomfortable. And what I'm talking about are these like 3-hour sermons. Or like 7-hour things where you're going there and you're there all fucking day and they're preaching at you for hours and hours and hours, and you're just sitting there being assaulted by this stuff. And I assume there's an implicit like you don't get to leave kind of thing, and that there's this implicit like spiritual authority of the person that's in charge, that if they don't say that you can go, that you're dismissed that you can't go. And so then you like, this is me just recounting now my experience, not what you said, but there's this feeling like that you're stuck. And I'm saying this because this was the experience that I had in Christianity, where I felt like I could not leave. I couldn't step away, not necessarily just like during a sermon, but during particular moments, like very spiritually charged moments, that it would be almost a sin to stand up, to walk away, to go take care of yourself, to be done with it, to have been offended by maybe something that was said, to just be done for some reason. And that ended up being something that was really traumatic for me, because I, through that and other similar experiences in Christianity where it's implied that you don't have autonomy in the moment, I've struggled to gain back autonomy over moments that I'm in. So like, it's hard to just like, if I'm being talked at, like if there's a guy who's just going on and on and on to me about some shit that he thinks that I need to hear, I feel this thing inside of me that I'm not allowed to, and there's a little bit of misogyny involved in that particular example, but there's this feeling inside of me like I can't leave. I can't tell him to stop. I can't do anything. I have to stay here. There's an authority here. I guess the question I'm trying to get at is that I didn't see any of that kind of a reflection or experience in your book. Is that something that you ever felt or not really?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that I think there's a reason for that. Yeah, like I think there's so many church services in this book, That's a good kind of trigger warning for people who read it. But
Yeah.
this service when I was 15, like this is the moment that I kind of see as when I kind of intellectually left the church, and unfortunately I didn't realize till later, but brought a lot of the crap with me. But I walked out to go to the bathroom because that was the one thing that you could do. That was the one place you could go where people wouldn't necessarily, so that's what I did. But in all these services that I was in Nigeria, so part of the reason why I did this trip to Nigeria was because I was in graduate school. I kept writing about my experience growing up in the church. And, 15 years had passed. I hadn't been in a church service for 15 years. So I had come a long way in terms of, I had established an identity apart from the church. And I think that's really important, like that's what allowed me to kind of go back. But the other huge important fact is that I went into those services as a researcher. That was the hat that I was wearing in those services. And it was very clear, especially in Nigeria, where I was the only white person in those congregations. And I told people that I was a researcher. They knew that I was there with some kind of sense of objectivity, even though I had a conversation with this wonderful reporter, Alma Guillermo Pietro, and she said that she's written about religion across the world, and only Pentecostals, there's the only ones who try to witness to her, even as a reporter. So I was in a lot of those situations where I was having these conversations with pastors. I was in these very long services, but I was taking notes, and I wasn't there simply as myself. If I had been, I don't think I could have done it, and the one service that did kind of break me in some critical way was this church service that I attended with my younger brother toward the end of the book.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. That was really horrible for me to read.
Oh my God. It was the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and I hope that does come out in that scene, because for the first time I was really implicated by all of it, and this happened, I'm not sure of the exact math. It was before I had my son. So it was probably like about 5 years ago. It was this awful situation where, long story short, this pastor kind of gets in my face and says, "Are you a Christian?" Like in front of my brother, in front of my mother. And I'm an adult, I have power in a way that I didn't before. I could have gotten out and walked away, but I didn't, I instead started crying and was angry, but I felt like I couldn't leave. And I think it was a huge reminder of the power that pastors have in those moments. It was awful. It was awful.
I was sneaking a look at my phone when Pastor Peter called all the visitors up to the altar for prayer and healing. 2 or 3 others stepped up to the front, and then Pastor Peter called the rest of the congregation up to pray for them. After a moment, it became clear that my mother and I were the only ones still sitting in our chairs. Pastor Peter began praising the Lord for meeting all of our needs, making us whole, and giving us the power to overcome the enemy. I was still sitting in my seat next to my mother, playing through my day in my mind. By the time we got back to my parents' house, Sam would probably be there. My mother was going to make some lasagna, and I'd drink a beer in the kitchen and probably help her chop the onions. And if my nephew took a nap and my father was in a good mood, then maybe we'd all play canasta. That's when the pastor opened his eyes and interrupted his prayer. I heard my name and my spine went cold. I looked up, and Pastor Peter was beckoning me to the front of the sanctuary. The people gathered there turned around to see who he was calling out to. I smiled in a ridiculous way and shook my head slowly, and then the pastor's tone changed. "Come here," he said. I shook my head again, and my smile faded. My brother and his girlfriend were up there at the altar, and I wouldn't let myself look at them. I could tell that the pastor wasn't used to being disobeyed, and suddenly I was afraid. I stuttered out the word "no," but it was too quiet. Pastor Peter beckoned me again, his voice stern. He demanded some additional response, but my mind had gone soft. I couldn't think of what to say. Then the pastor rushed down the aisle in long strides, carrying his microphone with him. "What do you believe?" he thundered. "Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God?" Tears welled up in my eyes and my neck turned beet red. I tried to talk but could only stammer.
In that moment, I became a child again, struck dumb in the face of a powerful man, of God. I don't believe. It's a simple question, he snapped, looming over me. In a quivering voice, I said, I don't believe the same way that you do. Suddenly, my mother was standing up, putting herself between me and the pastor. She shouted at him, telling him to leave me alone. I'd never seen her so angry, had never heard her voice raised like that in a public place. Meanwhile, I remained in my seat, totally silent, tears running down my face.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, you were almost crying triggered reading it, weren't you?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Oh, that is great. That is fantastic. And how tough.
So be wary. It's a little bit of a triggering book, but
If you're like
in a
Marie,
good
you'd
way.
like to be triggered.
Yeah, it can be healing to go back there and to remember the bullshit that was done to you and to see it contextually as that. I'm not putting words into your mouth, Jessica. I'm just talking from myself.
I've had a few people reach out and say, I only thought this happened to me.
Yeah. Do you know what this reminds me of? Like rape culture.
Yeah.
Where we're taught, and at least in the 80s and 90s we're taught, just say no.
Yeah.
Like no means no.
Yeah.
And the reality of how things play out is much more gray. Like you're shocked when you're assaulted, and in the end, if you didn't fight hard enough, you didn't scream loud enough, then you weren't really raped and you wanted it or whatever. And so I'm just thinking about how that experience is. You're just so shocked. This guy comes from the pulpit, comes right for you, says your name, yells at you, demands to know your faith beliefs in front of the whole fucking congregation, and you're just stunned and you're crying. And in the ideal world, if someone said, okay, if a guy does this to you, if a pastor does this to you, what are you going to say? You'll be like, oh yeah, I'll be like, fuck off, dude.
I know. And the magic in that moment is my mom, who's still a devout believer, who was heartbroken about my book. You know, she cannot believe that I wrote about being bisexual, that I wrote about not being a Christian. It's devastating to her. But in that moment, she was the one who said, leave her alone, you know, and I've never felt more loved by my family than I did in that moment, where she protected me, because even though she really cares more than anyone else in the world, whether or not I'm a Christian, she saw that for what it was, you know, and she saw that as a power move on his part. So eventually I realized that the path to the story I wanted to tell was going back to these moments, you know, the moment where I got in that baptismal font in this too big choir robe, you know, the moment where I did mushrooms in college and was so freaked out that I ended up speaking in tongues as a way to like soothe myself, you know, the moment where in Nigeria, this pastor called me to the front of the stage and told the whole congregation that I was a virgin, you know, which I had lied about. Like, I mean, it was just like, these are the stories of religion. It's not about, you know, these esoteric, abstract concepts. So, you know, I wanted to write about what it was like to be such a devout believer and then to not be such a devout believer. And unfortunately, I don't really have any like well-formed like pieces of advice for people who find themselves in that situation. But I think for me, there was something very healing about getting back to those moments. Like, my mom is a social worker and she does EMDR therapy with people. Where, are you familiar with that? You could probably describe it better than I could.
Well, they kind of did what I was mentioning before. They kind of try to bring you back to those memories and help you heal.
Yeah. Like going back to these moments in time where you were really in it, you know, in one situation or another, like a moment of, you know, where you experienced abuse or trauma. Or for me, when I was in these church services, trying to be in it as fully as I can. Because when I write these scenes, I like close my eyes and I'm like, okay, what was on the wall? You know, what sounds kind of trickled into the room? You know, what did I do next? Like, you try to rebuild that world. And I think the experience of doing that without being that person anymore, you know, is a really healthy experience, because, you know, it turns out when I was that girl, you know, who was in those services without any other place to go, it was horribly traumatic. But now I'm a woman, you know, now I do have some power. And I think reliving all of that and getting some distance from it is wonderful, you know. So I really encourage people. I'm actually going to do this thing soon with this guy, Brian Peck, who's a secular therapist. Do you know
we
Brian?
know Brian.
Yeah, so we're going to do some writing workshops for people who want to kind of explore creative writing as a way of kind of just seeing some of the stuff, that they might have avoided.
No fucking way. That sounds
We're really excited about it.
How can people find out about that if they're interested in following up?
We haven't set a date yet because Brian sadly broke his leg in a horrible way.
No.
But he's getting better. Yeah. But so he has a Facebook presence. His organization is Room to Thrive. I have a website, jessicawilbanks.com. So we're going to advertise it through our different, email lists and stuff. Writing is not therapy, but let it.
Who says?
I would disagree.
I don't know. I kind of. I wear two hats because, I think that, I do these community workshops where I see people really thriving once they face kind of truths from their past. But at the same time, writing to be art needs to be much more than processing your own shit, So I think what I want to do in these workshops is some exercises that give people the freedom to just kind of put stuff on the page without judging themselves for it, going back to some of these moments. And I really do think there's something therapeutic in that. I think taking it to the point where it becomes art, there's a lot of work to be done from that generative space to, to that other side. But yeah, I'm really excited about these upcoming workshops.
I just feel like the last thing I wanted to say was that as I was reading this book, I kept feeling this compulsion to share it with my partners, and because none of them were raised religious and they don't understand my experiences or my trauma, despite being very supportive of me. And it was just really, I don't know if there's other books like this out there. I bet there are, but just so eloquently and vividly describe the emotional experiences and physical experiences of being involved in a culture like that. And so I'm really grateful that you took the time to do that, because I think it's going to be healing for a lot of people to be able to read through something that maybe they don't have the strength to go back to experience themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I can't think of anything that would be similarly to your experience doing this podcast. We make meaning from our lives by making it a little bit easier for someone else that has been in the same position.
Are you saying, Marie, that you read that to your friends to give them an idea, or you're saying that?
I have not yet. Yeah. I just kept on thinking about how I wanted
it's
them
that
to read
good.
it.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up, and I really I've enjoyed this so very much, and I'm impressed with you. I don't know, just the environment in which you found yourself, not only poverty, but just the church, and how do you come out of that? I mean, you are impressive. You had the wherewithal to notice at age 15 there's something wrong here, and then go on to do what you've done with your life. And I'm just amazed sometimes at the how did that come out of that? How did how does so I'm congrats, I guess. I don't know, it's a beautiful thing.
You're proud of her, right, Cass?
Yeah, I'm trying not to say that.
I kind of think it's because I don't know, I think that life is always more complicated than we think. My dad, for example, he was full of rage, and he was a very devout believer, and there were a lot of really unfortunate things about his presence in my childhood, but he also loved poetry, and he would read us these wonderful poems by William Wordsworth, and he would cry as he was reading them because they affected him so much. So I don't know, it's always such a mixed bag, for all the pain of growing up in this kind of culture. I feel like I also learned a lot, and I also spent a lot of time as a kid thinking about what's worthwhile,
Right.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful writer, Chimamanda Adichie, who talks about the danger of a single story. And I think there's not one story about growing up, Pentecostal or any other way. And there's not one outcome that you can always expect from that.
Yeah.
Jessica Wilbanks. The book is When I Spoke in Tongues, A Story of Faith and Its Loss.
Yes.
You read it. I didn't. As usual.
As is tradition.
So,
Yes.
but my impression from hearing, you talk with her is that, and offline, you and I've talked about it. It impacted you.
Yeah. Yeah. It resonated a lot with me. And I mentioned it in the interview, but it was really cathartic to read someone else's descriptions of what they went through mentally, emotionally, physically during those moments in religion, which I just feel like for one reason or the other, my mind just kind of purged those very detailed, those very small details about the experience. And it just kind of became this just general, I didn't like that they taught me purity culture. I didn't like this or that. And I especially forgot those moments of feeling purpose and what it felt like to feel a part of something big. And I haven't had the strength to go back and to try to contextualize what that actually was and why it felt so good, how we were describing just being a part of something, big, that there's this war, and especially the parallels she drew to the experience of deconverting being kind of like what it feels like to leave a war situation where you're not fighting anymore.
Yeah.
There's no clear objectives anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. Those soldiers come home, and that's part of why they kind of either go a little bit crazy, or they have PTSD, or they're suicidal, or they become homeless. Is that the nihilism that sets in as to this civilian lifestyle? This is just so banal, and pointless, and whatever consumerist. It's the things that this culture prioritizes and values is stupid in light of people are dying. My buddy's died over there, or whatever, and the gravitas of those contrasting worlds is just too much for some, and that's part of the post-religious deconversion experience for some.
It is, for some of us, who are really into that spiritual element of things. Yeah, I just it's just so traumatic to even go back and try to imagine what those weird spiritual doctrines were, and that I ingested them and sat with them and moved with them. It's hard to go back to that, and her book brought that up for me. And some people might be game for going back there and experiencing those things, and some might not. So we're promoting an author, but not all of our listeners may be up for that, reading the details of what it was like to be religious.
Right.
But I definitely enjoyed, there's no verb for that, that I benefited from it, but it was painful, that kind of a verb.
Mm-hmm. It hurts so good.
It hurts so good. Oh, baby.
Come on, baby. So I also hear you in saying that I'm not sure she's a candidate for a guest on our show, because there's by leaving at 16, you got out while the getting was good, honey. You didn't. I don't know that she is. I mean, we fully experienced the trauma of leaving as an adult.
I still think the thing is, from the book, I can tell that she was super sincere in her faith up until she wrote in a notebook that she wasn't a Christian anymore. And yes, it was at the age of 15, which I think we discount as this very pliable time where you can move on. If you've made a decision at that point, you can move on and be well adjusted. But as you can see, even though she left, she was still inundated in the culture, had to play along, had to live a split life, had to deal with a lot of the fallout of having that kind of dogma pushed down her into her head. I don't think that there's a good chance that you're going to have some shit to deal with if you are raised in religion, even if you get out of it at an earlier age, because of the malleability of your mind at those ages to be fed those kinds of things. So maybe you release intellectually those concepts, but we all know that you're still going to carry that with you, especially if it was taught to you as a child.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And when she was kind of forced in an academic environment to find out where the fire is, where are the deep feelings that you have, this is what came up,
Yeah.
So, like, she was haunted by it still.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's the whole, that's exactly why she wrote the book, why she, that's why she went to Nigeria to do her studies over there, because she was haunted by it. She wanted to understand if there was any, like she said, any kernel of goodness or truth underneath it all. And I like the conclusion that she came to, because I think maybe sometimes when we're feeling the most cynical and jaded, we'll say there was nothing good at all about any of this shit, and we're just pissed off,
Yeah.
It's hard for me to emotionally relate to, but I feel drawn towards extending myself that way. The kind of compassion and the love of the humanity that she sees in church, like just the basic humanity of
Well,
it,
in everything.
That's the goodness. Yeah.
She's got a redemptive perspective on everything. Her dad was abusive, but she's like, but he read me poetry.
I don't know that he was abusive. It just sounded like he had a bad temper.
He was just violent, I guess, or angry. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's just that redemptive perspective. It's like, there's always another story. Beware of the single story.
Right. I think that when she goes back and works out these narratives and works through these memories, I think what could be happening is that she's kind of taking this memory that has built up in itself, this narrative of like, they were bad, I am good, or like whatever, just to make a very simplistic narrative around what happened. And when she goes back to those memories and embraces the reality and the humanity and the context of everything that was involved, I think that can be healing, because then you can extend, in so much as you're capable, you can extend compassion to those who were involved. You can see why they made the choices that they did, even if you don't agree with them. You can see the societal pressures on them. You can see maybe they didn't have other options. You can see all of the context, whether you like the context or not. It helps a little bit to take the sting out of maybe some of these memories where we're just pissed, we're just angry.
Or it was all bad.
Right. I think it's a difficult task to ask former believers to do. I think we're already doing a lot of work just to fucking recover. And then to have to do the additional work of looking back on what I'll call trauma, like looking back on that and extending, it's not necessarily compassion, being able to like contextualize what was happening, look at it maybe a little bit objectively, which doesn't mean releasing your pain or the fact that you were hurt or saying that was not okay. That's still, those things are still not okay, but extending your view beyond your own experience and also seeing the other factors involved. I think there's something that can be healing about that, but like I'm saying, that's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
Ask someone who's a former fundamentalist to do. It's if you're there and you've got the energy for it, definitely give it a shot.
It's not just in addition to your own recovery. I think it's part and parcel to recovery. I think it's a big piece of recovery, because if you give all the gravitas, if you give all the weight or all the definition of what happened there to one story, and you don't go back and at least give yourself the permission to say, but there was that one time, anecdotal, yes, but there was that one time that such and such happened. And I think it can, if there's a I don't know, a 2-ton anvil, hanging on your shoulders, if you can make it 1.5 tons by saying it wasn't entirely, evil, then why not, help yourself do that? I know that's what's worked for me in my therapy. Was I'd created a narrative about how my dad felt about me, and then he died when I was 17, so I haven't had a chance for the last 35 years to get any kind of clarification, because he's not here to say otherwise. And so in order for me not to just say he was disappointed in me, end of story, I was able to go back, or my therapist was able to help me go back and say, you remember that time that he bought you tickets to the Buddy Rich concert in Tulsa? And he did that for you?
Yeah.
He was proud of you. And he believed in you, and he was supporting your dreams to be a drummer. Yeah. There's that, Cass, and there's that other part that is a part of the story. And so let's bring that in. And like you said, give it context. Yeah. And all of a sudden, my dad is not the evil, and I'm not the disappointment that I thought I was. Yeah. So much so.
Right.
So there, the story. In general, just in closing, I always say this, I love to see overcomers. And actually, the more I think about that, I thought, like, if we're parading these overcomers week after week, is that encouraging to people that need the strength to overcome? Or they're like, oh my gosh, all these people are so perfect. And I know we've heard both. We've had both feedbacks from emails and stuff. It's like, I'm afraid to come on your show because everybody you have on is so smart. And so, whatever, they've overcome so much. I'm still wallowing in my own pain. And they seem to be on top of their game. Well, I just want to say about Jessica here, and I said it there at the end, but as far as how does that work? I guess the reason I'm in awe of these things is I don't relate to it as a person. I really, when I was growing up and I was banged around like a ball in a pinball machine, I had no wherewithal. I had no agency. I let out external circumstances kind of dictate to me who to be, what to do, what to say, where to go. And when I see somebody like Jessica who's like, okay, this is my family situation, this is my, poverty, my dad, all these situations, and then this is the Christianity I find myself in. And if I'll be damned if she didn't just find her own goddamn path. And where did that come from? Mm-hmm. Where did that come from? That's the human spirit, and that's against all odds. I mean, she's a woman in that world. Mm-hmm. She's got a lisp. I mean, that's just another thing to overcome. Yeah. In this culture. And here she has a master's in fine arts. She's teaching courses on creative nonfiction writing. Again, I'm just impressed. And I was like, where do you come from? What planet did you come from?
What if she's not exceptional? What if we are all that?
She's exceptional to me because I just lacked all of that. And I had everything going for me. White, straight male. You kidding me? Handsome as fuck. I had the world in my hands, and I didn't know what to do with it because I didn't have any agency. And I'm 53, and I feel like I'm finally coming in to what it means to be me.
One thing I wanted to come back to is what you mentioned about our listeners feeling like maybe it's defeating to listen to these stories because they interpret them as these people have overcome so much. One thing I just wanted to react to that is that personally, all of the people that I've interviewed, I don't look at them and go, oh, look, this is the story of where they started, and then this is where they finished, and they achieved, success, and they are at success. Like, I don't interpret any of those stories like that.
They haven't arrived.
Hear people talking about their journey. They still have a lot ahead of them. They figure some things out, and then they don't have a lot of other things figured out. And personally, just like talking as the co-host of the show, I don't give a fuck. Like, if you haven't overcome X, Y, or Z, I don't give a fuck. Like, I just want to see you, like, here, now, who you are with what you've got going on. I don't want to interview these people in a context to be like, hey, look at what you can achieve. I see it more like, hey, look at the shit they've been through and are going through and are moving, what direction they've chose to go in. And I want to interview people who are just living and just want to talk about their stories. And everyone's in a different place in their story, and everyone's going to go in a different direction. And I don't give a fuck where they go and how fast they go. I just want to hear about the stories,
Well, it sounds like you want me to take down this thing on my wall where I've ranked every guest from top to bottom as who's the best, most impressive overcomers, and who's the most mature and who's the least mature. You're wanting me to take that down, it sounds like.
That is the epitome of the horrible stuff that we've been talking about, Cass. No.
She's a winner, everybody. Be a winner. Go be a winner. Because Jessica is a winner. Go.
Oh, my God.
Ready, go.
So we've set the standards for everyone, so make sure to meet them. And if you don't come on back.
Yeah. If you want to be like Marie and I and Jessica, raise the bar. Come on now. That's our show.
Oh my God.
Let's go. Let's get out of here.
All right. Bye, Cass.
Bye-bye. Okay, so some of the fun stuff.
Yeah.
Have you ever had any exposure or training in improv,
No,
like comedy improv?
I have not.
Okay, so it's a creative process, and in that you are with a group of people, or maybe just another person, and you're about to engage in some form of storytelling or conversation, fictional, that is made up as you go, and a lot of times, at least in the Second City version, they ask for a word, any word from someone in the audience, and they all start yelling out, and they'll just pick one and they'll take it from there, and they'll build a story or a narration around that word, and just it goes from there. But the key is to say yes and to every dialogue, to every banter. You never say no. You just say yes, and then you add to it. They in turn say yes and add to it, and then that's where the story takes a pattern. But one of the exercises that they do in improv training is they'll line up a group of people. And it could be however many, 3, 4, 5, 8, and they'll put them in a line because they're going to build a story one word at a time.
Oh wow!
So once upon a time, and then the person on the end will say one word. The next person will say another word. Next person will say another word. So the story takes on itself, but only by way of these interjected one-word, modifiers and such.
Oh, that's awesome.
So would you be willing to do that with us on the air right now?
Sure, yeah.
Whatever you want to do.
I'm not sure if I totally get it, but I'm sure you'll tell me.
All right, so I say, once upon a time, and I say there, and you say
Was
a
dog,
full
of
steak,
because
he
wanted
to
eat
a steak. Sorry.
We're so good at this.
There was a dog full of steak because he wanted to eat a steak. Yeah.
I think we've successfully demonstrated why collective creativity is not always possible.
The hard part about these exercises is ending the sentence and starting a new one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, we found it pretty easy to do. Oh, man. Wow, I just had a huge thunderclap here.
That was huge.
I heard that. I thought that you had like a
So
train
weird.
outside
It's like
your apartment.
totally, it's not raining or anything right now. But
Dang.
Oh, we've pissed off God now.
We're totally keeping this in the episode.